The sweltering midday of July 17, 1944, in Moscow was exceptionally stifling, muggy, and tense. On the scorching asphalt of the Garden Ring, tar was slowly melting, and the thick city air was filled with a strange, almost tangible, ringing silence, only occasionally broken by the muffled, monotonous, rustling shuffle of tens of thousands of feet wrapped in dirty rags or shod in broken hobnail boots. Through the streets of the Soviet capital flowed an endless grey, dusty and foul-smelling river of 57,000 German soldiers and officers. This was not a triumphal parade of victors in the conventional sense. It was a march of the vanquished, a grand, unprecedented psychological performance on a massive scale, which entered world history under the deeply classified and ironic codename the Grand Waltz. But why was the name of a light, elegant Viennese musical comedy chosen for this cruel, large-scale, and risky military political operation? What truly lay behind this staggering propaganda triumph? A brilliant tactical move by the Soviet leadership designed to visibly convince the wavering Western allies of the imminent and inevitable collapse of the Third Reich, or a cynical, deliberate violation of international humanitarian conventions, exposing defenseless prisoners to public mauling and shame before a multi-million-strong crowd exhausted by years of terrible war. Let us try to completely discard the familiar ideological slogans of both sides, forget for a moment Soviet posters and German justificatory memoirs, and look into the deep, gloomy backstage of this historical event to understand the price that had to be paid for the show of force and what secret, sinister mechanisms were set in motion within the depths of the Kremlin and Lubyanka for the sake of a single summer day. To fully comprehend and appreciate the scale of what was happening, we must travel back a few weeks to the fateful June of 1944. Exactly 3 years after the Wehrmacht's treacherous invasion of the Soviet Union, on June 22nd, the Red Army launched the grand strategic offensive operation Bagration on the territory of Belarus. This was not an ordinary frontline breakthrough or a local pushback of the enemy. It became a veritable tectonic shift in the course of the entire Second World War, a crushing blow of incredible, devastating power that literally vaporized, wiped off the face of the earth the mighty German Army Group Center. Colossal forces of Nazi Germany were caught in the giant Soviet pincers, as military analysts call a deep, two-sided envelopment of the enemy's flanks, followed by the linking of attacking spearheads and complete encirclement. Soviet deep operation military doctrine was realized here in its absolute textbook form. The enemy's front cracked, crumbled, and collapsed like a flimsy house of cards in hurricane-force winds, and the pace of the Soviet advance astonished even the most experienced strategists. In a matter of weeks of lightning-fast offensive, Soviet troops advanced hundreds of kilometers to the west, fully liberating Minsk, Mogilov, Vitebsk, and reaching directly the borders of East Prussia. The Wehrmacht's losses were not just catastrophic. They were unprecedented. Dozens of divisions ceased to exist. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, or found themselves helplessly captured. However, in the West, these staggering victories were initially met with a great deal of healthy political skepticism and distrust. At the very time when Soviet information bureaus, through the voice of Yuri Levitan, were daily reporting on the encirclement, dismemberment, and complete annihilation of yet another German army corps, a deep, silent distrust reigned in the high offices of London and Washington. The Anglo-American allies, who had just landed in Normandy during Operation Overlord on the 6th of June 1944, were advancing into French territory with immense difficulty, suffering heavy losses and literally gnawing their way through every meter of the echeloned German defense in the villas, hills, and narrow roads of Normandy. To Western generals and politicians, the official reports from Moscow that the Red Army was capturing dozens of high-ranking German generals and tens of thousands of soldiers daily seemed an obvious, crude exaggeration of the Soviet propaganda machine. The Western press, raised on respect for the military might of the Third Reich, continued to write about unbreakable German tenacity and expressed serious doubts that the Wehrmacht had indeed suffered a total defeat on the Eastern Front. Supreme Commander Joseph Stalin understood perfectly well. In the context of a fierce geopolitical game, mere paper reports, dry numbers in newspapers, and displays of captured weapons were clearly insufficient. What was needed was irrefutable, graphic, crushing, and absolutely undeniable visual proof of the Soviet triumph. Something that would silence any Western skeptics once and for all, boost the morale of the Soviet people, and secure for the Soviet Union the unconditional status of the main, dominant force breaking the back of the Nazi beast. It was thus in the strictest secrecy, within the depths of the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, that the audacious idea was born to march thousands of German prisoners right through the central streets of Moscow. Stalin entrusted the direct, detailed planning of this highly complex and top-secret operation to People's Commissar for Internal Affairs Lavrenti Beria and his first deputy, Colonel General Arkady Apollonov. The plan received its ironic, almost mocking codename, the Big Waltz, a direct reference to the famous American musical film of the 30s, for which the Soviet leader had a great personal fondness. This name held a deep, sarcastic subtext. The German soldiers and officers, who back in 1941 had boasted in letters home of their dream to march in a victory parade on the cobblestones of Red Square, were now destined to dance their final, humiliating waltz under the watchful guard of Soviet bayonets. However, organizing the safe delivery and passage of 57,000 enemy military personnel through the militarily throbbing heart of a vast state was not just an organizational challenge, it was a veritable logistical nightmare. Let's consider the scale. It was necessary to discreetly, under conditions of the strictest secrecy, extract tens of thousands of prisoners of war from frontline distribution camps in Belarus, form dozens of railway trains, about 40 large convoys, ensure their reliable 24/7 security en route, organize uninterrupted feeding, minimal medical care, and at the same time completely eliminate any information leak to prevent the German Luftwaffe from attempting a preemptive bomb strike on the trains or the places of mass concentration of prisoners in the capital itself. From the beginning of July 1944, these trains, overflowing with human cargo, began moving from the stations of Vitebsk, Orsha, and Minsk in the direction of Moscow. The people were transported in wooden freight cars, the infamous Teplushki, under conditions of incredible, suffocating overcrowding, unsanitary filth, and exhausting summer heat. Many of the German soldiers were wounded, burned, and psychologically broken by weeks of continuous, fierce combat and subsequent wanderings through the deep Belarusian forests and impassable swamps. The overwhelming majority suffered from severe gastrointestinal disorders caused by drinking raw swamp water and rotten food scavenged from their surroundings. Upon arrival in Moscow, these trains were unloaded at freight stations under the cover of night. The prisoners were concentrated at several key points in the city. On the grounds of the Moscow Hippodrome on Begovaya Street, at the enormous Dynamo Stadium, and on the vast exhibition field on Karamishevskaya Embankment. All these extensive areas were hastily encircled with multiple rows of barbed wire and tightly cordoned off by select, heavily armed units of NKVD convoy troops. It was here that the prisoners received an unexpected surprise. For the first time in a long while, they were given a hearty, substantial meal. They were issued a special reinforced ration consisting of hot porridge, fresh bread, and lard, and were provided with an unlimited amount of clean drinking water. But one should not be mistaken and take this for a sudden display of Christian mercy or humanitarianism on the part of the Soviet leadership. Stalin and Beria pursued purely practical, cynical goals. The emaciated, half-starved man needed to be physically capable of enduring the many-kilometer exhausting march on scorching asphalt under the blazing sun. They were not permitted to faint, die along the way, create bottlenecks, or spoil the overall perfect picture of the grand Soviet triumph. But in this meticulous, scrupulous preparation, there was another, far more subtle and cynical psychological aspect. The German prisoners of war were strictly forbidden on pain of severe punishment from washing, shaving, cutting their hair, or making any attempt to tidy their clothing and footwear before entering the city. They were intentionally left in precisely the same wild, unseemly state in which they had been overtaken and captured in the Belarusian forests and dirty trenches. In torn uniforms stained with blood and sweat, in greasy field caps without waist belts, which were confiscated for security reasons, without insignia. Many marched barefoot or with their feet wrapped in tattered rags and pieces of burlap. The only starkly conspicuous exception were the German generals and high-ranking senior officers. Contrary to the general logic, they were not only permitted but strictly ordered to put on clean, full-dress uniforms, to polish their boots meticulously, and to affix to their tunics all their numerous Nazi orders, crosses, medals, and badges of rank. Why did the Soviet leadership need this strange masquerade? The answer is simple and hits with the force of a backhand slap. So that the entire world, and above all the foreign journalists present, could see with their own eyes that marching before them was not a faceless, chaotic mass of unfortunate Volkssturm militiamen or ragged recruits. Before them marched the highest military elite of Hitler's Germany. Those very same arrogant, haughty Prussian aristocrats, Knight's Cross holders, and battle-hardened generals who, just yesterday in Berlin, had planned the destruction of the Slavic peoples and world domination, and who today were trudging submissively, dejectedly, and pitifully under the guard of simple Soviet lads. The sharp contrasting visual image between the dirty, sweat-stinking rank-and-file soldiers and the generals polished to a shine, who were followed by guards in impeccable uniforms, was a powerful, meticulously calculated act of information and psychological warfare. The morning of July 17, 1944, began with an emergency radio broadcast. The residents of the capital were informed that on that day, a large contingent of German prisoners of war captured by the troops of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Belarusian fronts would be marched through the city. Muscovites were asked to maintain order and not allow any excesses. By 11 a.m., the Garden Ring and adjacent streets were packed with people. Eyewitnesses recalled that the crowd was incredibly dense. People stood on the sidewalks, climbed onto rooftops, balconies, fences, and trees. Everyone was waiting for a spectacle that, just 3 years earlier, when the Germans were at Khimki, had seemed unthinkable. And then, exactly at 11 o'clock, a command rang out, and an enormous grey column began to move. The prisoners were divided into two unequal groups to minimize strain on the city's transport arteries and to cover as large an area as possible. The first, main group, numbering 42,000 men, moved clockwise along the Garden Ring. At the head of this column walked 19 German generals, led by the commander of the 35th Army Corps, Lieutenant General Kurt von Lützow, and the commander of the 41st Panzer Corps, Lieutenant General Edmund Hofmeister. They walked in silence, looking straight ahead, trying to preserve the remnants of military dignity, but their orders and medals, gleaming dully in the July sun, only emphasized the depth of their fall. Following the generals were senior and junior officers lined up by rank, and then endless rows of soldiers, 20 men abreast. The column was escorted by mounted police with drawn sabers and NKVD soldiers with rifles at the ready, whose bayonets menacingly flashed in the sun. 57,000 people. This was the population of an entire town, and when this mass began to move, a heavy, unique drone of thousands of shuffling feet rose over Moscow. The second group of prisoners, consisting of 15,000 men, moved counterclockwise along the Garden Ring, starting from Mayakovsky Square, then turning onto Bolshaya Sadovaya and Kaluskaya streets, heading towards the Kanachikovo station, where prepared railway trains were already waiting for them. This route was designed to show the prisoners to residents of other districts of the capital and to avoid giant traffic jams in the city center. Let's consider these numbers. The total length of the routes amounted to several dozen kilometers, and throughout this entire path, the prisoners were under the close scrutiny of hundreds of thousands of people, each of whom had lost someone close in this war. This was an incredible emotional strain, a powder keg that could have exploded at any second from the slightest spark. And here a question arises: which Soviet official historiography Long tried to avoid? How exactly did the Moscow crowd react? Soviet newspapers of the time wrote exclusively about the anger and contempt of the Soviet people, about shouts of "death to the fascists" and "that's what you deserve." But if you turn to the secret NKVD reports, compiled based on intelligence from agents in the crowd, and to the personal diaries of Muscovites, we see a much more complex, tragic, and profound picture of human feelings. Certainly, there were aggressive shouts, whistling, and jeering. Groups of young men tried to break through the cordon to strike the prisoners or throw stones at them. But the escort harshly and quickly suppressed these attempts. However, the dominant emotion in the crowd was not furious anger. It was a heavy, oppressive silence. Imagine these women standing in the crowd. Many of them had husbands who perished at Stalingrad, sons who burned in tanks at the Kursk Bulge, daughters who were taken away for forced labor in Germany. And now, before them, marched those who had done all this. But instead of iron supermen in black uniforms, they saw exhausted, staggering from fatigue, dirty teenagers and old men in grey rags, with animal fear frozen in their eyes. And at that moment, in the souls of many Russian people, it was not the desire for revenge that triumphed, but a deep, age-old Christian pity for the vanquished enemy. Eyewitnesses recalled how elderly women crossed the passing Germans, wept and whispered, "They are just children, like ours." And their mothers are surely crying for them somewhere too. There were recorded instances when people from the crowd tried to throw pieces of bread or twists of tobacco to the prisoners. The guards strictly prevented this, pushing the compassionate Muscovite women away, but the very fact of these attempts indicates that Soviet society had not turned into a blind machine of hatred despite all the horrors of the occupation. And what did the prisoners themselves feel? If you look at the German memoirs of those fortunate enough to survive and return home, we see that for most of them, this march began with the horror of awaiting death. When they were loaded into trains and taken deep into the USSR, many were convinced they were being taken to a mass shooting or to hard labor in Siberia, from which there is no return. Their passage through the streets of Moscow was perceived as preparation for a public execution. Every rustle in the crowd, every sharp shout seemed to them a signal for the massacre to begin. But as they progressed along the route, fear gave way to a dull, apathetic indifference caused by physical exhaustion. The heat did its work. People fainted from heat stroke. Their comrades caught them by the arms because falling was not allowed. The convoy had warned that stragglers would be considered escapees with all the ensuing consequences. The shuffling of thousands of feet merged into a hypnotic rhythm that drowned out all other sounds. And here we come to one of the most famous and yet delicate details of that day: the famous watering trucks. In virtually every documentary about the Great Patriotic War, these shots are shown. As soon as the cordon closes behind the last rows of German prisoners, dozens of watering trucks drive out onto the asphalt of the Garden Ring and begin to lavishly wash the streets. Official Soviet propaganda gave this action a deep symbolic meaning. The capital was being cleansed of fascist filth, washing away the very memory of the enemy's presence on sacred Soviet soil. It was a beautiful, powerful artistic image that entered all history textbooks. But let us descend from the heavens of ideology to the sinful earth of physiology. 57,000 people suffering from severe dysentery and stomach upset after the unusually abundant and fatty Soviet rations issued the day before walked through Moscow for several hours. No public toilets were provided along the route, and no one intended to stop the column for this. By the end of the march, the Garden Ring was a sanitary catastrophe. The decision to send the watering trucks after the column was dictated not so much by poetic symbolism as by elementary requirements of hygiene and epidemiological safety, to prevent an outbreak of cholera or typhus in the overcrowded summer Moscow. This fact leads us to a serious legal and ethical dispute that continues to rage among historians and legal scholars to this day. Was the Parade of the Defeated a violation of international agreements? The main argument of the critics of this operation is the Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war of July 27, 1929. Specifically, the second article of this convention explicitly states that prisoners of war must be protected from acts of violence, insults, and public curiosity. At first glance, marching prisoners through the streets of the capital in front of movie cameras and hundreds of thousands of onlookers is a classic, textbook violation of this requirement. The prisoners were put on public display, turning their humiliation into an element of a propaganda show. Defenders of the Soviet version of events countered this by stating that the Soviet Union did not ratify the 1929 Geneva Convention in its entirety, although at the beginning of the war it did declare its readiness to observe its basic humanitarian principles on a basis of reciprocity. But did Nazi Germany adhere to these principles? When we speak of violations of conventions regarding German prisoners in Moscow, we are simply obliged to place on the other side of the scale the fate of Soviet prisoners of war in German captivity. By the summer of 1944, millions of Red Army soldiers had already perished in German concentration camps from starvation, cold, disease, and brutal shootings. The German leadership did not consider Soviet soldiers to be people deserving of protection under any laws of war. They were starved in open-air camps, used as live targets, and subjected to medical experiments. Moreover, at the very beginning of the war, German troops conducted their own marches of Soviet prisoners through captured cities of Ukraine and Belarus. But those marches were accompanied by mass shootings of those who collapsed right in front of the local population and beatings. Against this horrific backdrop, the Moscow Big Waltz appears to be a model of humanity and strict discipline. The NKVD escort ensured 100% safety for the prisoners. None of them were killed, beaten, or maimed by angry citizens. From the point of view of life safety, the Soviet side fulfilled its obligations impeccably, albeit in a specific form. But let's look at the political effect this operation managed to achieve. On the balconies of embassies along the Garden Ring stood military attachés from the United States, Great Britain, and other Allied powers. They counted the passing columns and filmed the events with still and movie cameras. Footage from Soviet newsreels capturing the big Waltz spread around the entire world within days. The effect was like a bomb going off. The Western press, which just yesterday had doubted the successes of the Red Army in Belarus, changed its tone to one of enthusiasm and even reverence. Newspapers in New York, London, and Paris ran headlines about the greatest defeat of Germany in history. No arguments from the German command about a planned shortening of the front line and elastic defense were taken seriously any longer. Stalin achieved his goal. He vividly demonstrated that the backbone of the Wehrmacht was broken precisely on the Eastern Front, and he did so at a time when the Allies were still dawdling on the approaches to Paris. This strengthened the USSR's negotiating position at the future conferences in Yalta and Potsdam, where the fate of the post-war world order was decided. And what was happening in Berlin itself? The German Ministry of Propaganda under Joseph Goebbels first attempted to completely silence the Moscow events. However, hiding the passage of 57,000 people was impossible. Too many families in Germany were awaiting news of their sons and husbands fighting in Belarus. Soon, the Soviet side began broadcasting radio transmissions with the names of prisoners and showing newsreels through neutral countries. Then, Nazi propaganda changed its tactics. It was announced that the march in Moscow was a cheap Bolshevik fake, a stage set where the role of prisoners was played by disguised actors, extras, or people rounded up from the streets. But this lie did not work. German mothers and wives, peering into the grey frames of the newsreel, recognized the faces of their loved ones. For German society, the Grand Waltz became the deepest psychological shock, shattering the myth of the Reich's invincibility and showing that the war was inevitably rolling towards its finale on German soil itself. Amid the glitter of this propaganda triumph, it is easy to forget the price paid for it. The 57,000 prisoners on the streets of Moscow are only a small part of those who remained forever in the Belarusian swamps. Operation Bagration cost the Wehrmacht over 400,000 men killed, wounded, and captured. But the losses of the Red Army were also colossal. During this grand offensive, Soviet troops lost over 170,000 men killed and missing, and the total number of wounded exceeded 500,000. Behind every meter of liberated land, behind every German general walking dejectedly along the Garden Ring, stood thousands of lives of Soviet soldiers who gave everything for this victory. The March of the Defeated was a beautiful, theatrical screen meant to hide this bloody, terrible price of war, turning it into a pure, flawless triumph of state will. Let us reflect on what would have happened if the situation had gotten out of control. Imagine an alternative scenario. A mass riot breaks out among the crowd of Muscovites, exhausted by years of deprivation and grief. The cordon is breached, and the enraged people begin lynching the prisoners. Or the German generals, deciding to preserve their honor, refuse to walk the streets and stage a sit-down strike right on the square. NKVD documents show that the Soviet leadership calculated all possible scenarios. The security for the march was unprecedented. There were several armed guards for each prisoner, snipers on the rooftops, and reserve regiments of internal troops stationed in the alleyways. Any attempt at rebellion, whether from the crowd or the prisoners, would have been suppressed instantly and with extreme severity. The prisoners themselves understood this perfectly well. For them, obediently marching along the route was their only chance to survive. Fear of Soviet weapons and the strict discipline of the convoy ensured perfect order where a storm of human passions should have raged. What was the further fate of these 57,000 participants of the Grand Waltz? After the march ended, they were taken under guard to railway stations and loaded into wagons. But their path did not lead to execution, as many of them feared. They were distributed among the camps of the main administration for prisoners of war and internees, GUPVI, of the USSR NKVD. Most of them were sent to restore the destroyed cities, factories, and mines of Donbass, Stalingrad, Leningrad, and Moscow itself. Thousands of prisoners labored for years on the construction sites of the Soviet capital. It was by their hands that many residential buildings in the Stalinist empire style were erected, lines of the Moscow metro were laid, the buildings of Moscow State University on Vorobyovi Gori were built, and entire neighborhoods on Oktyabrskoye Pole were constructed. Mortality among prisoners of war in the camps in 1944 to 1945 remained high due to the effects of exhaustion, but the Soviet leadership tried to preserve this workforce. The majority of the march participants returned to Germany in the late 40s, and the last of them, including the surviving generals, were released to their homeland in 1955 following the visit of FRG Chancellor Konrad Adenauer to Moscow. Analyzing the march of the defeated through the prism of decades, we see an event of incredible complexity, in which military necessity, geopolitical calculation, sophisticated propaganda, and the deepest human tragedy were tightly interwoven. It was not a simple demonstration of force. It was a multidimensional message addressed simultaneously to three different audiences. To his own people, Stalin showed that the colossal sacrifices were not in vain and victory was near. To the Allies in the anti-Hitler coalition, it demonstrated who was the true master of the situation on the European theater of war. And to the German people and the leadership of the Third Reich, it delivered a crushing psychological blow that accelerated the internal collapse of the Nazi state. But can the violation of ethical norms and international legal standards for the treatment of prisoners be justified by political expediency? And here, dear viewer, we approach the main paradox of this story, which I want to offer you to resolve on your own. Before you lie two completely different, yet in their own way, logical historical truths. On one hand, the strict law of international law, humanism, and Christian mercy, which demand respect for the dignity of even a defeated and cruel enemy, no matter what crimes he has stained himself with. From this point of view, the Grand Waltz was a humiliating spectacle that violated the spirit of the Geneva Convention and turned human tragedy into a propaganda farce. On the other hand, the harsh truth of a total war for survival, in which the USSR lost 27 million of its citizens. In this system of coordinates, the march of 57,000 prisoners through Moscow was a brilliant, bloodless psychological warfare operation that saved thousands of lives of Soviet and Allied soldiers, hastened the collapse of Nazism, and proved to the whole world the strength of the spirit of the Soviet people. Weigh all these facts, ponder the voices of the eyewitnesses, look at these faces in the newsreels, and answer for yourself. What was this day in history? A triumph of the great spirit of the victors, or a dark page where morality was sacrificed for political triumph? Which version of events seems to you the most just and historically honest? The decision is yours alone.